for making them possible. And I'd like to call out special thanks to Amy Scarpignato, who has been providing a lot of the support behind the scenes and keeping the Zoom wheels turning. This afternoon's session will be a little bit different. It will consist of two parts. And to get us started, you're already very familiar with Anna Lellismith, who joined the Road to Recovery team and has been instrumental in helping us to move forward. Anna is a PhD candidate in Dr. Amanda Rodewald's lab at Cornell University, and she studies how resident and migratory birds in Guatemala respond to natural restoration of cattle pastures. So Anna will be providing a brief overview of where we've come so far and then point to where we're going in the next hour or so. So Anna, take it away.
Thanks, Tom, for that intro. And thank you so much to everyone in the audience for coming to this, whether you've been here through the entire workshop or are just joining us for this session. It's been really awesome to have so many people participating in the workshop. So like Tom said, I'm just going to give a quick recap of the research we've heard about over the past couple of days and some of the big takeaways, and then lead into the final panel discussion of the workshop. So over the last 3 days, we've heard a lot of really exciting talks from experts at the forefront of research on migratory connectivity, population demographics, and on using those components to really try to figure out what is driving population trends across the full annual cycle. So we've heard about new satellite technologies for tracking smaller birds than ever before, genetic tools for assessing population structure across species ranges, and creative frameworks like network analysis for looking at migratory connectivity. And we've learned about the utility of networks like MODIS, MAPS, and MOSI for understanding movement and vital rates, as well as about what is needed to scale up those networks in order to better understand limiting factors for more species. We've heard about where we are in our understanding of the limiting factors and specific causes of decline for a broad range of species in case studies from shorebirds to warblers, as well as about what new information or analyses we still need for those species to move them up this pyramid toward recovery. And we've also heard about some really innovative and exciting ways to integrate data from different sources and different protocols to look at continental scale demographics and to strengthen our understanding of abundance and population trends. So I'll just highlight some points that have been made over the past few days that I found really exciting and important to keep in mind. One is the need to think about the temporal as well as the spatial component of migratory connectivity. So several of the talks showed that even if populations are migrating through the same stopover areas, they can still be really isolated from one another if they migrate at different times. So it's super important to consider both aspects of migratory connectivity when trying to understand how discrete different populations are. And another idea that I thought was really important was expanding the MOSI model of banding during the non-breeding season to the US to figure out what's going on during the winter for short distance migrants that stay here over the winter. A lot of the common birds in steep decline on the priority list, like dark-eyed junco, for example, fall into this category. And we could really learn a lot about what is causing their declines by focusing more on non-breeding ecology in the US, as well as outside of the US. And then a couple of broader ideas have also really come through clearly for me from the talks, from the discussions with panelists, and also from the great questions that we've been getting from the audience. So one is that it's really important and why it's so important to focus at least some of our efforts on single species. So again, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be tackling broad threats or trying to understand spatial or temporal patterns across multiple species. But we've seen through these talks that not only are there likely to be multiple causes of decline across different species, but there's also often not a single limiting factor or cause of decline for one species. So we know that different subpopulations can have drastically different population trends, and they can also have different causes of decline. So as we heard from Clark, for example, some populations of wood thrush may be more limited by habitat loss in the breeding grounds, while others might be more limited by non-breeding habitat loss. So we really need to focus on discrete linked populations within the priority species to figure out what's going on with each subpopulation and to manage subpopulations. And a couple people have mentioned that this is part of the reason why waterfowl conservation has been so successful. apart from all of the funding, is because that is the level at which we're managing game birds. And then related to this is the really exciting potential for retrospective analyses of existing data. So we have a ton of information on how population trajectories vary across species ranges, and we can take better advantage of that data now using new information on migratory connectivity. And we can also look at how population trends have varied over time and retrospectively relate that variation to land cover change, climate change, or other factors to really try to figure out what has influenced population trajectories over time. And I think that one of the most important points to come out of these talks and discussions is the need to connect with each other more and collaborate. So everyone wants to give Kristen Reg feathers from their species, and she's excited about using them. And I think that that's just one great example of the opportunities and the desire to strengthen science around declining species by connecting and cooperating across areas of expertise. And this includes being a lot more intentional about organizing and integrating existing data. There's so much work already going on the ground, and so much data that already exists from banding stations, from small projects conducting targeted work on individual species, as well as from sources like radar, as we heard about this morning, that have existed for ages, but just haven't been used till now. So there's all this existing data, and we need to put more effort and funding into integrating different sources of data from different protocols, into database management, and into growing these networks of banding stations and MODIS towers in strategic and coordinated ways. And overall, we need data to be more centralized and more obviously accessible so that new researchers who want to get involved in this kind of work, who really want to move these species along the pyramid to recovery, can easily get a better idea of what data already exists for those species and where the remaining gaps are. And as a grad student, I want to come back to a question that was asked on the first day about how young students and researchers who are just starting out and are really passionate about recovering declining birds can get their ideas heard and get connected to these efforts. So I'm just going to speak for all the panelists and say that I'm sure any of them would be happy to hear from students and other young people about ideas they have and topics they're excited about working on. As we've seen over the past few days, there are a lot of experts in the field who are looking to collaborate, who are excited to apply their methods to new species, who have topics in mind that they want students to work on, and who would also be open to new ideas from students. And as I said, there's all this existing data out there to be analyzed and integrated, and still a lot of new data that needs to be collected in the field, especially for species that aren't as far along in our understanding of their migratory connectivity, their demographics, and even for some species, the full details of their range. So there are so many research needs in recovering 3 billion birds. So if you're interested in research around how to recover declining species and not sure how specifically to get involved, feel free to reach out to me, Ken, Pete, Tom, Brant, or anyone whose presentation at this workshop was exciting or interesting to you. So I will just end by talking a little bit about the last panel of the workshop. So this is a really important segue from the science around bird declines to implementation. And this is a little bit of a sneak peek into the next R2R workshop, which will probably be sometime in the spring, which will be a lot more focused on how to put the science into practice and actually recover birds through management, policy, and changing human behavior. The first two workshops, this one and the one in July, were really focused on the science of understanding why species are declining. But as you've probably heard before from Ken and Pete, the science of figuring out the when, where, and what of bird declines is the very first step in the road to recovery. And the bulk of the work of recovering the North American avifauna will really be about people, about communicating the importance of bird conservation and how people can change their own lifestyles to be more bird friendly, about collaborating across many different stakeholders to implement management changes, about creating new policy mechanisms to protect birds and better fund conservation across the annual cycle, and to figure out in general how to leverage more funding to support all of these efforts. So the next panel discussion is about that, about the transition from gathering the data and doing the science to communicating it, to implementing it, and to integrating it with human dimensions to really make these large-scale social and political changes that we need to bring back birds. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Kendrick, who's going to be moderating the panel discussion. Sarah is the state ornithologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation. She's a Missouri native who got both her bachelor's and master's from the University of Missouri, studying avian response to savanna and woodland management in the Ozarks. She recently built the Missouri Bird Conservation Plan with partners across the state, serves as the chair of the Telemetry Initiative for the Midwest Migration Network, is involved in Partners in Flight, and serves as the Missouri contact for all things bird. So take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Anna. So thanks, everybody. I'm very excited to be the moderator today and be part of a group that's so open-minded and really stressing the urgency of these bird declines and this need for massive collaboration. It's a very exciting time. So yeah, I work for a state fish and wildlife agency. And so I know that I saw some other state folks on the call, which is great. So I know most of you are largely researchers in academia, and that's great. So I was asked by the webinar planning team to add in my perspective as a state agency. So you may hear that time to time. I hope you don't think I'm butting in too much. But land management agencies are certainly groups that I feel we could do a better job of folding into these discussions in particular. And so you may hear that time to time with me harping on that. So let's jump in. Today we're discussing implementation, and Pete has mentioned before that the road to recovery is about 10% science and 90% implementation. So huge piece of it, of course, but maybe the toughest part. So clearly implementation is a big challenge, including both on the ground management, but also the messaging of this issue and calls to action that we saw with the 3 Billion Birds paper and the 7 simple actions. So we're here to discuss that with our panelists who work to advance implementation of the science and those messages at regional or national scales. So Todd, if you would turn on your video, I'm going to introduce Todd Fearer, who works for American Bird Conservancy as the coordinator of the Appalachian, however you choose to pronounce it, Mountains Joint Venture, one of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's migratory bird joint ventures. Todd also represents the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures on the U.S. NABC committee. Todd also co-chairs NABC's Private and Working Lands Subcommittee, which I have questions about later. And he's leading NABC's ad hoc Bring Back 3 Billion Birds team. So welcome, Todd, and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. So yeah, I'm going to just provide some comments from the perspective of the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures and kind of what I see are the next big steps for us. You know, the core of the joint ventures are our partnerships and working with partners to leverage our collective resources on the ground to accomplish conservation at a scale and a scope that isn't possible by any one organization. And, you know, we've been pretty successful with that in my own humble, unbiased opinion. But, you know, we've heard through a lot of the talks here, and it was called out in the 3 Billion Birds paper, the increase we've seen in waterfowl populations over the same period of time that we've seen the decreases in the other populations. And that work was accomplished through a lot of the work of the joint ventures. The JVs were formed to address the waterfowl conservation needs identified in the first waterfowl management plan. And so, you know, we were successful in playing a role in that arena. We've now since expanded to all birds, and that changes the ball game. And as we've heard, you know, many people say, and Pete and Ken say this as a result of the paper, business as usual isn't working. And the way that we've approached conservation for just the waterfowl, that's not going to work for all birds. And so, you know, in going to that all bird arena, that changes the landscape, both just the physical landscape and those components that we work with, but also the human landscape and the dimensions there that we're working with. And we have to adapt to that because the challenges that we face from all bird conservation are much, I would say, bigger and broader than they were when the focus was initially on waterfowl. And so the JVs need to adapt accordingly to that. And there are a lot of ways that I think that could look. Certainly working at scale. We've heard a lot of different presentations here in the last 3 days about working at scale and affecting populations at scale. And we were, again, successful with this for most of the waterfowl species. And so doing that for the other priority bird species, the other birds that really need it, is going to be critical. And we've seen this start to happen. The JV8 partnership that some of you may be familiar with, it's the 8 joint ventures in the Central Grasslands region that have come together to address grassland needs collectively across that region. Was one really good example of that. And so, making sure that we are working at the proper scales and partnering at the scales to really make that impact. I think one of the other really big areas is relevancy. Waterfowl was relevant in the context that there was a constituency that had a very vested interest in seeing waterfowl populations maintained and increased, within the waterfowl hunting community, and then the state and federal agencies responsible for that management. And we don't quite have that same relevancy with all birds. And so finding the messages, finding the ways in which we can make bird conservation relevant to others, I think is critical. This has been a big focus of NAPSI over the last couple of years. And you have some JVs that are really looking at novel ways to do this. The Playa Lakes joint venture, they've really started to focus a lot of their messaging on recharging the Ogallala aquifer, because their conservation efforts for birds also helps with that recharge effort. And that's been a really important thing that's resonated with a lot of the local municipalities within that JV geography, and they've been getting support from those municipalities. For us here in the Appalachians, it's looking at ways that we can start to integrate a lot of the questions about forest carbon and forest management practices that align with good forest carbon in lieu of, or in light of, climate change, and a lot of the discussions about needing to maintain forest carbon. And then, looking at other opportunities, for example, working with other initiatives like the White Oak Initiative, where their efforts to conserve and enhance white oak is really in line with a lot of our forest management goals in the Appalachians. And, maybe trying to partner with, say, the bourbon industry that relies very heavily on white oak and white oak barrels for bourbon, as well as other industries. And, can we create bird-friendly practices or certifications that might mesh with some of those industries? And then I think finally, and this is a little bit of my own personal opinion, but it's something where I really hope the JVs start to move in, especially the joint ventures that have a lot of migratory species that are wintering in Central and South America. And that's putting a bigger focus on full annual cycle needs and working with international partners and encouraging our partners to work with international partners. This is a deliberate step that we have taken. We have components of our current operational plan that are focused on this, trying to encourage our partners to get more engaged with wintering ground projects, be it through Southern Wings or other avenues. And I think this is something, as we've seen with several of the presentations here, for wood thrush, for golden wings, and other species, making sure that we are addressing that full annual cycle component is going to be critical for those of us who have those species in our joint venture geographies. I could say a lot more, but we've got a lot of other really good panelists, so I will stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Todd. I have questions for you, but I think we'll wait until everybody's gone through their 5 minutes part of the discussion. So thank you so much. It's such an important piece. BCRs and JVs are so important, and they're such a cool mechanism of partnership and really pushing those messages at that regional scale. So thank you very much. Next up is Noah Matson. Noah is the Deputy Assistant Director for Migratory Birds for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In his role, Noah serves as the Chief Operating Officer of the Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Program, overseeing all aspects of the program, including administration of the Duck Stamp, North American Wetland Conservation Act, and Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act grants, survey and banding programs, and policy and regulations. No pressure. Noah has 20 years of experience working on wildlife conservation policy issues, both inside government and on the NGO, non-governmental conservation community. So Noah, welcome and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for the opportunity to provide some perspectives here. This is such a critical topic and really important to Fish and Wildlife Service. And we've been concerned about the trajectory of bird populations for years, and the 3 billion birds paper really put a capstone on work that's been ongoing for a long time and added a new urgency and scale to all of that. And so coming off the heels of that, we put together an internally focused effort, recognizing that we need to get our own house in order, the Fish and Wildlife Service, before we kind of project and really ramp up partnerships outside the service. And what I mean by that is, the Fish and Wildlife Service was in large part established to conserve migratory birds, and we have a lot of programs and pieces that focus on that. But over time, we're a large bureaucracy, a lot of very decentralized agency. We've kind of ended up where a lot of pieces are doing their own thing. A lot of pieces are doing great things for birds, but not necessarily talking to each other and really synergizing and leveraging all your nice buzzwords together. And so this effort, starting just with the Migratory Bird Program and now expanding outward to the National Wildlife Refuge System, until our law enforcement program, our science applications program, has started these cross collaborations and breaking down of silos within our own agency that's already leading to some exciting opportunities and results. And that's really my kind of take home message is, can we use this, the high profile nature of this, this paper and the momentum behind it to do more of that at scale, to break down those barriers to everybody collaborating even more than we have, and to bring in those new audiences. And I will pivot now to the federal government writ large. Huge footprint on the landscape, and from a funding standpoint, from a land management standpoint, and from a impact standpoint. Different agencies have different pieces of that puzzle. And a lot of you may or may not be familiar with, but there was a Clinton era executive order 13186 that outlined federal responsibilities for migratory birds. Because really, it's not just the Fish and Wildlife Service's responsibility. The United States government has signed treaties with other countries on migratory birds. And that executive order really lays out how the government writ large is set to implement those treaties. And even under this administration, we continue to have those conversations with those other federal agencies. Agencies like the Border Patrol and Coast Guard have come to us for memorandums of understanding on bird conservation. And so we really think that that effort is poised to really expand and get reinvigorated in the near future, and opening up tremendous opportunities with agencies like USDA, which has such a huge footprint for birds. Finally, we're thinking a lot about, there's obviously some big picture, big needs that might need new legislation and really big ticket items like that. Really excited about those opportunities, but also looking at what are the birds in the hand, so to speak. We just had some really important legislative wins this past fall, the Great America's Outdoors Act and the permanent reauthorization of Land and Water Conservation Fund. Those are two tremendous amounts of infusion of funding, one for habitat protection, and how are we going to make sure that habitat protection is maximized for bird conservation. And then the other, the Great America's Outdoors Act is deferred maintenance, which kind of makes your eyes glaze over, and things like crumbling roads and visitor centers for national parks. But we actually view it as a big opportunity to address bird collisions with windows, and how do we use that funding for retrofits and new builds of the federal infrastructure to make them more bird friendly. So I guess those are some of the things that we're thinking about. Again, it's been pretty exciting to see people really just energized to be brainstorming. What are the things that we can be doing? And a lot of the things don't even take that much more new funding, if any new funding at all. It's really about collaborating better. I guess my final thought is the trajectories that are mapped out are decades in the making. And although that we have a sense of pent up urgency to solve the problem tomorrow, we really have to take the long view. And I think there are, from a policy standpoint, there are these punctuated opportunities, but on the ground, in terms of the seeing that in the populations of birds, it's going to take decades, and we have to roll up our sleeves, think about that long view and how to get there. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Noah. I have one quick question. Can you just really briefly tell people what the Great American Outdoors Act is and how you think it may provide an influx of funding?
Sure, it did a number of things, but the one I was referring to really targets deferred maintenance of federal land management agencies. So it's really park centric in a lot of ways, but other agencies are eligible for the funding. The Park Service has some upwards of $10 billion of pent up demand for all sorts of maintenance of park facilities. And so one of the things, aspects of that law provides a pretty substantial tens of millions of dollars to tackle that. And not just for the Park Service, but for other agencies. And so we view that as an opportunity to, again, tackle facilities where there are bird collisions to make those more bird friendly.
Right.
In terms of, we are in control of our space, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we do have discussions with our sister agencies, but that's an opportunity where outside partners can be whispering in the ears of other agencies to kind of augment and plant that seed.
Absolutely, or provide blueprints of changing those collision those steps you can take, EMPs and things like that.
Right. And I don't necessarily think that federal facilities are a significant portion of the 1 billion birds a year that we lose from collisions, but it's like anything that you want to push out. The federal government has such huge footprint, it charts the way. And we use that as a tremendous opportunity to educate others. And so we're viewing it as much as an outreach opportunity, and it's a demonstration project in addition to actual conservation benefits.
Absolutely. And while collisions aren't as sexy an issue as some of these, large scale research projects with these really neat findings, I mean, it makes a direct impact. We can all, at any level where we are, a grad student, professional researcher, wherever we are, we could be talking to local municipalities or our campuses or whatever, talking about window strikes or collisions of other nature. So you got to start somewhere for sure.
Yep.
So thank you, Noah. We will get back to you with other questions in our panel discussion, but I'm going to move on to Tammy Vercauteren. Tammy is a Michigan native. She earned a bachelor's degree in wildlife management in 1995 from Michigan State University and a master's in 1998 from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she studied sandhill cranes. She began working for Bird Conservancy, then Colorado Bird Observatory in 1999 as a specialist in GIS and landowner outreach for the Prairie Partners program. She has been Bird Conservancy's Prairie Partners Coordinator and Outreach Director and has served as Executive Director since 2008. She enjoys working with partners and encouraging proactive voluntary efforts for species conservation. And she believes it is relationships with people that will make a positive difference for conservation now and in the future. So Tammy, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and everyone for tuning in. I wanted to get a little background on the Central Grassland Road Map Summit and then some ideas and recommendations as the road to recovery moves forward with implementation. So a little background, been working on the Central Grassland Summit with several partners that are on the call today. And the reality is, based on World Wildlife Fund plow print map, we're losing about 2 million acres of grassland habitat every year in the Central Plains. Closely tied to those grasslands are also plant and animal species we're losing, including birds, as well as human communities, from indigenous to Ejido to private landowners. And as you're working on the road to recovery, several species rely on these healthy grasslands: Brake's pipit, Barrett's sparrow, mountain plover, chestnut-colored longspur, and lesser prairie chicken. And the Central Flyway extends from Canada to Mexico, and it's nested in a working landscape that's intermixed with cultivated land, indigenous, public, as well as over 80% private. So as we strive to change the plight of our grasslands, we need to address the economics of people on the land, balancing habitat, healthy communities, and being very cognizant of economic reality. And as we've been talking about, and you've been talking about through this workshop that's been elevated through the 3 billion birds effort and recovery, business as usual cannot continue. We're doing great things out there, but the disparate efforts are not adding up. We need a conservation movement to change the plight of our grasslands. There's no one entity that can do it all, and we need a unified vision and a collaborative approach to change the trends from land health and resiliency to grassland bird decline. So we've been working as a collaborative representing 8 sectors, 3 countries, and more than 30 organizations to develop the Central Grasslands Roadmap. We've been fortunate with catalytic funds of support, from helping with professional facilitation to website to coordination and interpretation. And those funders have varied from foundations to industry, state, and federal partners. I encourage you, if you haven't, to go to www.grasslandsroadmap.org to learn more. And we'd love for you to tune in and join and bring your expertise. Currently, 150 organizations and 300 folks have contributed to the roadmap elements to date. And we also were very strategic in trying to make sure we engage leaders in the roadmap. So as they can empower their staff to contribute, and they want to make sure we succeed in achieving the goals of the roadmap. And we've also been very intentional about getting to measures of success. What are the big stretch goals, and how are they relevant to the diverse audience and sectors and their values? We want to see 200 million acres conserved, restored, enhanced over the next decade. We want to stabilize grassland bird declines, and we want to see more than $1 billion invested in the resources and communities in the Central Plains. We really focused on 3 themes that were actually identified as NABC as priorities, including partnerships, policy and funding, and research and evaluation. So that's a little history and background. So as the road to recovery moves to implementation, you need to be thinking about what partners are missing. Who are the leaders that have expertise that aren't at the table? Where will the challenges need to be addressed? Who is this most going to affect? And who is underrepresented? So in the Central Flyway, particularly in the US, our key federal partner is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're in every county out there. And we need to be also engaging Indigenous and private landowners. This is where the conservation, the restoration, the land conversion needs to happen. And this varies by the different countries and what policies and programs are out there. We need to focus on how do we do this better together? What are the landscapes and realities? What is the local knowledge and expertise that need to contribute to our efforts? And how do we honor and recognize diverse cultures, diverse voices, and making sure what we're doing is accessible to different communities? As you're moving forward in communicating the priority research needs and results, what audiences are you going to target? How can your communications relate to people on the ground? We can't limit our stakeholder and constituency engagements to just a few key groups. Outreach by all partners, strategically targeting the audiences across the demographics with messages and calls to action that relate to the interests, motivations, and are tangible to the communities. When you look at the research and knowledge gaps, what additional information should you be collecting that matter to the people and the landscapes you're working with? Are the measures you're collecting things that we can actually manage and change? Grass height, grass structure, grassland dynamics. How are you bringing in also the expertise of the land managers who can take what you're recommending and actually apply it on the ground? So for the Central Flyway, birds are a measure and a metric, but we want landowner and community engagements. We also need to be looking at rangeland productivity, soil health, water conservation, cattle weight gains, and economics. We absolutely have to be forwarding human dimensions and understanding the values, the motivations, the needs. How did the research and results that you're creating, how do you message that to the values and needs of the people managing the land? You also have to be thinking about the economics and understanding short and long-term costs of conservation. How do we value ecosystem services provided by these functioning intact landscapes, clean air to clean water, carbon sequestration? And we need to be thinking about setting measurable goals and evaluating progress and efforts along the way. How are you evaluating the outcomes? How are you providing adaptive feedback, making sure we're doing the right things in the right places, getting the return on our conservation dollar? I know we're short on time, Sarah, so I'll hold policy and funding. If there's time, I can add a little more, but thank you.
That sounds great. I have a question, Tammy, before we leave, because I think you got 1 minute. And I may not be a question for just 1 minute, and we can get into it later in the panel discussion, but what was your biggest challenge in pulling together the Central Grasslands Roadmap Summit? It's amazing. This is a really cool initiative across an entire natural community in grasslands, regardless of who you work for and what you do. So what was your biggest challenge? And then what are a few of the objectives or examples that came out of this that you all are working towards now?
So the challenges was just trying to be very intentional and trying to, make sure what we're doing reflects the 8 different sectors out there, including 3 countries, and making sure it's accessible to the diverse communities. Honestly, with COVID, in some ways, it made this opportunity more accessible because then we went to virtual and more people can tune in. So we've got to make sure that we still want that human component and people coming together and collaborating, but making sure that we have the resources that everybody that wants to help be part of the conversation can come together as a community next year, we hope. And some of the key things that are coming out are, looking at particularly the US Farm Bill and what can we pilot this year to inform the future Farm Bill. There's some really cool policy efforts that World Wildlife Fund and National Wildlife Federation are doing. How do we get more momentum and energy around those and connect the dots about what really needs to happen? And then, we want to make sure we're very intentional with the road to recovery work and the science that's being elevated and making sure we're bringing that to the table for this effort. So we're streamlined, consistent, and elevating the greatest priorities. And then also a big thing that came out of this is we've really got to get grasslands on the roadmap and greater attention of different sectors of our communities. And we want to talk about a branding effort and a messaging effort that really helps bring to light what our grasslands need for our nations and our culture and our future.
Nice. That's really exciting. And I have more privately on questions in the panel discussion, but it's just very, very exciting. Grasslands are one of the ones that sometimes kind of bog me down when I'm trying to remain optimistic about the future. So I'm very excited about that effort, and it's really cool to see all those partnerships. That's amazing. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Miyoko Chu. Miyoko is the Senior Director of Communications at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. In her past life, she was a behavioral ecologist who studied Phainopeplas and a science journalist who wrote a popular book about migration, Songbird Journeys, at a time when Icarus was still in its infancy and there was no such thing as MODIS. What a sad time that was. Since then, she has focused on leading communication strategies that have engaged millions of people with information about birds, including development of the Merlin Bird ID app, which I tell people to download all the time, All About Birds website, which I send people links to all the time in my job, live bird cams, and most recently, partnership efforts to gain widespread media coverage of the loss of 3 billion birds and the follow-up campaign, 7 Simple Actions, which we all know received unprecedented coverage in the media. So very impressive there. So welcome, Miyoko, and go ahead.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so if you can just imagine behind the scenes on publicity for the science paper on the loss of 3 billion birds, a team of scientists and communicators from the co-authoring institutions had begun collaborating a full year before publication to produce the messaging and the multimedia assets and the follow-up campaign, 7 Simple Actions. And since then, the group has grown and continues to plan new efforts. I've put the names of collaborating organizations in the chat there. And you can really think of us as the communications arm of the 3 Billion Birds Coalition writ large. We want to amplify science-based messaging in ways that will increase the number of people willing and able to act for birds and the environment. And to do that, we're focusing across 3 arenas: science, policy, and bird-friendly lifestyles. So on the policy front, the American Bird Conservancy and Audubon have taken the lead on developing a legislative bird agenda for the 117th Congress, or Migratory Bird Rescue Package, as we're calling it more colloquially. It's a package of 15 bedrock bird protection policies that prioritize addressing threats to birds, but also capacity building through funding, research, planning, and partnerships. And so to engage the public in supporting those priorities, I'm really excited about 2 prongs of activity underway. One of them is Audubon's Migratory Bird Initiative, to be launched in the summer of next year. So this is a collaborative partnership that is going to generate interactive visualizations of bird migration and priority areas based on tracking data from researchers with help from MoveBank and MODIS, as well as data from eBird and USGS and other sources. And the aim is really to spark joy and knowledge about bird migration, but also to inform conservation and generate grassroots advocacy for policies that are going to help birds as well as human health. Another prong is developing a test project to use storytelling techniques to spur policy action. We haven't decided exactly how to focus that, but we've been talking about how important techniques are to localize stories to make them more relevant, to use data visualizations and information customized to special interests or to what will resonate with whatever target group that may be, and testing some of those messages, which is not something we always do. So that's policy. In a second arena, we're looking at how to spur lifestyle changes, building on the 7 simple actions. This fall, we had a great example of customizing scientific data to motivate regional change, behavior change. That was with Birdcast, which used migration data and light pollution data to generate a list of the top 10 most dangerous cities for migrating birds. And also the peak periods when turning out the lights would help the most birds. So after working with partners in one of these cities, along with help from our new spokeswoman for the birds, former First Lady Laura Bush, the Dallas mayor proclaimed lights out nights and urged businesses and residents to turn out lights in their city. So there's a science-driven action that we saw just this fall. But that's just one example within a broader movement. We're really excited to support a newly forming bird-friendly coalition. It has some 50 organizations who are bringing together expertise in conservation, outreach, and business. And the aim there is to create a world where bird-friendly actions are more the norm, from science and monitoring to development of bird-friendly products, or just mainstreaming actions and purchases that can help birds. So in the next Road to Recovery implementation sessions, you'll hear more about that emerging movement. And the third area is science communications. And I really think of that as the forte of our communications group. I feel like we are right now the batters standing in the batter's box, waiting for the pitch to come in from you scientists so that we can swing and we hope hit it over the wall with your next big message. So we are on standby to help with that, perhaps the next big message that has yet to emerge from your collective Road to Recovery efforts.
Thank you, Miyoko. That's great. I'm so very inspired by the fact that you're even on this panel and as part of this webinar. The 7 simple actions was just incredible, in addition to all the other education. You know, in a lot of my conversations with Missourians, which is a very rural state, the people who have noticed the bird declines, which when the public notices it, you know that it's pretty bad when they've noticed it through their lifetime. But many of the people who've noticed the declines are rural folks who grew up on farms, and with that mass exodus to urban areas and the trends just going that way, are we about to lose the generation who had that link to the outdoors and that experience? So how, especially with rural folks, in my mind, but everyone, how do we make those messages more relevant and get to them? It's a tough one, I know. But.
Yeah, no, but that's clearly top of mind for all of us. We heard it from the other panelists today too, the huge need to find that relevancy. And what I would say is really critical, whether it's with the rural audiences, which we really should do, more effort to engage, but any audience really, is investing in the social science and marketing research and testing. It's not something that we at the Lab of Ornithology have had the luxury of doing, because those require investment in resources and expertise to do, but we are talking more about it. I know partners are talking more about it, and recognizing how incredibly pivotal that will be, because none of us knows what that message is out of our own heads. We have to go to those audiences and hear from them.
I totally agree. And that's just great that we're headed that direction to ask people what resonates with them. I think that's really important. There's huge discussions on the state agency front as well about relevancy, mostly because our hunting community is retiring and stopping hunting, and there isn't that generation to follow them up, because it's just all very systemic and complicated. So relevancy is certainly a hot topic amongst many different realms. So now I'm going to move us into our panel discussion. So if all the panelists could turn on their video, please. We'll go into some questions here. So we kind of talked about how each of you are kind of changing business as usual, as we know that what has been occurring in the conservation world may not be enough or isn't enough for us. But how do we increase that implementation on the ground? How do we communicate the messages in each of your worlds? I'm wondering if each of you can go through and just talk about a few ways that we can translate that science into implementation on the ground. Is that just increased communication with folks who are doing on the ground management? Is it synthesis of results? Is it worries about generalizability across a whole region to be able to tell the land managers how to change? What are some concrete ways that you all are taking steps forward to help with that implementation on the ground?
Well, I'll start, since I kind of started us off anyway. There's a lot of different directions I could go with that, but
yeah, sorry.
No, I think one of the key areas, and especially if you're going to talk about taking the science that comes from these road to recovery efforts and others and really starting to translate them into implementation, that's actually something that I've thought a lot about as this workshop has gone on. And that's also one of the components where I would say business as usual has not been working. We always talk about the implementation gap and not being able to effectively translate science into conservation on the ground. And I think that, a lot of the avenues that we kind of think of and rely on, publications, conferences, even some of the species working groups, those avenues haven't been effective. Even some of the presentations that we heard over the last couple of days, I've been familiar with Clark's work, but wasn't up to date on it. Callie's related wood thrush work that we heard on, I think that was the first day. That work would be critical to our work in the Appalachian Mountains joint venture, because wood thrush are one of our priority species. But we lack the means to consistently convey those results to our partners. And so I think we need to rework how we do that, and whether that is, instead of something like a TWS meeting or an NAOC, more of a conversation-oriented work group meeting that focuses on conversations between the science component and the implementation component, that isn't the 15-minute presentations that we're used to, scattered across a dozen different sessions that we all have to decide what's the best one. So I think that's the component that I think we need to rethink, is how we deliver that science to the on-the-ground managers in a way that is much more consistent and much more effective for adapting those results. So that's my 2 cents at least.
I very much agree. And I mentioned in a question during Callie's presentation about wood thrush is if folks on the ground doing management on the Gulf knew how important their work was to such a massive percentage of the wood thrush population that's staging there before migration, if that happened in Missouri, that would add so much relevancy and passion and excitement for what folks are doing on the ground and how they're contributing to the whole of a species. And I think that that's really powerful. And so communicating that, I think, is so important to states, which or other NGOs that are doing land management, folks we may not generally always have in the fold. It's so important to get that information across. But go ahead, others who wanted to chime in.
I guess just building on that, I think it's been mentioned a million times already about the need for conservation, social sciences, and human dimensions research and stuff. How does information spread and flow within this community and to the audiences we need? We have no idea. And so that's a different type of evaluation assessment, but one that's as important as the underlying information itself. It's like if a tree falls in forest, does anybody hear it? If a study gets published in Science, does anybody read it?
Right.
Does it hit the people on the ground? And so, being very thoughtful, not just making assumptions, like if I hold a webinar, that's all I need to do, but actually reaching out to your audiences and understanding how they get their information. And I think that alone would be really, really critical.
I was just gonna, as we're thinking about the Central Flyway, when we think about 3 billion birds, we think about 750 million grassland birds gone. Well, how do we step that down? How do we step that down to the country's responsibility, to the region's responsibility, to the state responsibility, the actual on the ground responsibility? And how do we bridge the gap between the people out there trying to manage the land and what the scientists are learning, and getting that cross-team effort of local knowledge, research, and making it more applicable to the ground? And again, that message is more relevant beyond just birds. Birds are one of our tools, but at the end of the day, that management affects that land health, which then affects the communities. And how do we also support the landowner cooperatives and empower them? And how do we engage the land trusts and the different communities that have the existing relationships with the landowners and get more buy-in and more energy and momentum, so we're all pulling in that same direction?
Yeah, I'm hearing this common theme about showing people how their actions can really make a difference in the communities where they live, the places that they care about. And so we talk about this idea of precision science to action, and we really are going to have the ability to help people understand what's going on with birds at any location, at any time of year, and about how the timing of their choices can make a difference, whether it's flicking out the lights, powering down a turbine, or holding off on mowing for a couple of weeks. But those are some of the pointed ways that I think people can start to see how an action relates to their place. And we just have so many great tools at our disposal now, all the way, we heard about how compelling those individual stories of tracked birds are, or combining that with a live cam and then being able to see stories across the hemisphere, like the connections with coffee and a farmer's life, or the life of a bird that's going to survive there. So I think for me, the challenge actually is there are so many choices about which stories to tell. How do we prioritize which ones and where we're going to try to make impact with so many fronts to worry about at once?
A question for Miyoko real fast, and then we'll move to the Q&A. I'll ask Anna for a question from the Q&A. I don't want to hog all the questions here, but Miyoko, what do you think worked so well with the 3 billion birds? Do you think it's the fact that we quantified it after 50 years? It was this big finding. Do you think it's that there was this coordinated communication effort? What worked, do you think, the best?
Well, I think a little of all of the above, but I must say one thing that I didn't quite anticipate was how much publishing in Science really elevated that opportunity. I do think we heard today earlier that the number 3 billion birds seemed to be something people could latch onto, but to have the distribution power of Science and that level of qualification on the study really helped get it out. And then, as I mentioned, the full year of preparation to back that up with visuals, multimedia, website, and a campaign, that was the harder part, really, I feel, was to make it a sustainable piece rather than a moment in the news. And that's still a challenge that we have to continue to work on, staying in the headlines.
Yeah, it's always hard to stay relevant over and over and over, with big stories like that. So
can I add to that quick?
Talked a little bit about.
Sorry, Sarah, I just felt like, I think the effort was Herculean, and the point also was that you had the bird community all organized coordinated and a unified voice together on that 3 billion birds. So it really helped get everybody on the same page and saying the same thing. And I don't think we can forget the value of that.
I completely
And
agree, especially
Sarah,
coming out of
can
this
I-
road to recovery. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I just want to put a little punctuation point on that, because there are so many scientists at this workshop. And so from the scientist perspective, putting that paper together, I just can't say enough about, never in my career has it worked that way, where we worked side by side with the communications team in advance, as Miyoko was saying. And I know, maybe that was a luxury because we sort of anticipated this was going to be a pretty big deal. And so the communication specialists from the organizations did come together, and Miyoko did a masterful job of leading that group. But we can't take that part for granted. And I think it's up to the scientists as well to seek out, Noah said that, well, we don't really know how that communication happens. Well, there are a lot of professional communicators, and even in our own organizations, and just getting all of those people to sit down in one room and then kind of force the scientists to sit down with them and work on this messaging, side by side, back and forth. Is this going to work? Is that going to work? I mean, it was a real process, and it's really important for the scientists to, be willing to and be able to engage in that as well. So I wanted to emphasize that point.
Absolutely. No, that go ahead, Pete.
I was going to say that Ken's hair was black when we first submitted the paper, and we had been working really hard with the communications teams, and we didn't know if the paper was going to get accepted or end up in some subpar journal. He was quite nervous, and now you can see what happened to his hair. So
Nice. No, well, and that's great that, all of, the 3 billion birds really resonated. It just shows you how powerful we can all continue to be, especially with the Road to Recovery effort, with all of our unified voice. And that's just one of the biggest questions I have coming out of all this is, how do we wrangle that? How do we put all these people together to influence policy and work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to change, federal regulations or policy? I know that's not the only way. But how do we unify if we don't have this publication to center around? Do we create this, I don't want to just create another committee or group, but how do we become most powerful in that? So Noah, do you have any input on especially policy-wise? Because I do, and I think most people think of the Fish and Wildlife Service as you mentioned, the protector and the lead on protecting migratory birds with a lot of international efforts and national policy. How do we move forward with the strongest voice, probably led by the agency, in addition to this broad group of people?
Well, I do think the bird conservation among any other conservation community has some of the biggest large-scale partnerships and long-standing partnerships out there. So I think all the ingredients are in place. I think NABC is a great forum. Do we need more entities involved in NABC? Probably. But I think a lot of the major players already have existing mechanisms to have that continued coordination. And I think this effort has really energized NABC like I haven't seen in a number of years. I mean, similar to the State of the Birds report to NABOR first launched, had this, again, a coordinated, purposeful strategy to both communicate about bird conservation as well as have some real concrete asks. As much as the Fish and Wildlife Service is looked to a leader in bird conservation, and we're proud to assume some of that role, we also have a tiny footprint. As big as we are compared to some of our NGO partners, we're a blip on the landscape, people. Certainly in lower 48, our land mass is tiny. We manage over 100 million acres of land, but 80 some million acres of that is in Alaska. So our footprint is a powerful footprint. We always have a regulatory hammer, but really it's all those other partners, all those other federal agencies, and it really takes all of us pushing, again, that common unified agenda. I think is really, really powerful. Instead of all of us pushing on different things, pushing on 3 big things consistently will have a lot of power.
Yeah, I completely agree. Let's hone messages to a few of these big big efforts that people can chime in on, which is hard across those international borders. I would remind everybody to put your questions in the Q&A, please, if you have questions. I will go to a question in just 1 second. Oh no, I apologize. But speaking of how the Fish and Wildlife Service is just up on the landscape, that leads me to talk about, again, private landowners. You know, 93% of Missouri is in private land ownership. We can only do so much on our conservation areas that we own and our other state lands. And so how do we move forward with that? I know I asked this a little bit, but you know, speaking to what some of the folks have said before, what Wayne said and others is how do we, when I think about it, how do we move forward without working with the ag community and ranching community? It just doesn't seem feasible without that. So if you're looking at it from that vein, what do we do about or federal reimbursement or Todd, you might have input on this on your committee approach with private working lands.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the short answer, Sarah, is we don't move forward without working with those private landowners. That's an integral component, and a lot of the JVs have really embraced that in the last 10 or so years. You know, we've got some really strong partnerships with NRCS, and you know, Wayne in his presentation referenced you know, CRP and talking about, you know, looking at CRP in different ways. And I think that one of the things that, and this is my own interpretation, I want to make that clear, but you know, we have been working with NRCS for long enough now that they're really starting to see their practices in that light in some cases, and the benefits of farm bill programs and working with private landowners, and the need to translate some of those outcomes, not only in terms of agricultural outputs, but also environmental outputs. And that's an area where we're trying to really steer them in that direction and say, hey, through our science and through our work on the ground, we can help you with that. We can help show some of those benefits. But I think the other really key aspect to that is engaging the private landowners directly. And I think it was yesterday, several times it was mentioned, those one-on-one relationships. And, you know, if you want private landowners to do more for conservation, you got to sit on the front porch and talk to them and understand, you know, if it's an ag producer in the Midwest, you know, what are their concerns from a working land standpoint, because they want to stay in business. And so if you can mesh together your conservation practices with their desire to stay in business and have it be a win-win, that's key. And again, that's something that a lot of the JVs are working towards. You know, in the Appalachians, it's from a working forest standpoint. You know, how can we work with landowners so that they can manage their forest in a way that's meeting their objectives, whether it's for revenue, whether it's for just having a healthier forest that they can pass down to, you know, their kids, if they want wildlife. You know, how are ways in which we can mesh our forest management goals with theirs and keep their forest as working forests and in forest ownership. And I think that's true. And that's one of the biggest issues, I think, especially in the grasslands, but across the US, when you're talking about private lands, is you want them to stay in that cover, whatever it might be. You don't want it to be converted to something else that takes it out of that habitat collective. So, you know, I think between things like the Grassland Summit that Tammy worked with and a lot of these other messages, it really is showing the ways in which our conservation goals can coexist with working lands goals, and it's not an either or question anymore. It's a both.
Right, absolutely. It's hard to compete with their bottom dollar. That's their living. It's the same with the wintering grounds efforts. You know, folks can't afford to care about conservation. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of similarities between those two geographies. But Anna, do we have a question from the Q&A? I don't want to ignore the Q&A at all.
Yeah, we have a lot of great questions in the Q&A. And I was distracted there for a minute answering some emails. So if I ask something that's already been touched on, Sarah, just let me know and I can go to a different one. But yeah, so there's a maybe kind of controversial and interesting question. How important is it to bring along the general public in conservation actions, or is it more effective to be more targeted at influencers?
I want to take a stab at that one. I saw I saw that question come up in the chat and have been thinking about it. I think it is very important that we start to make efforts to be better engaged with the general public. And I think the results that we saw from the 3 Billion Birds paper really demonstrated that. I think one of the avenues, and I'm going to speak from the joint venture perspective, I think one of the avenues for us to do that and do it effectively is through citizen science, community science efforts. And there you do need to be somewhat strategic in a lot of different respects. And I think, if you have, members of the public within whether it's a joint venture or whatever arena you're working in that can serve in that influencer role, you definitely want to try to be strategic and prioritize them. There are some JVs, especially the Western JVs, that have private landowners on their management board. These are large owners that have large land holdings, they're ranchers, and they have a very influential role within that ranching community and with congressional officials and others. And so that's one very pointed example there. But I think if talking larger scale and kind of grander blue sky, if we're really wanting to be effective long term, we got to get the general public more engaged than what we have in the past. And so it's a definite need. I think the challenge is doing it strategically.
Yeah, I think it's, I agree with that. I think ideally you do both, obviously, but I think also completely depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve some brand new, huge piece of legislation that needs a full vote of Congress, then you're going to need a broad constituent, a movement to push it. If you're looking for a targeted appropriations ask, it might be just the chair of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee. And if you're looking to influence how NRCS implements its Farm Bill programs, it might be purely a target towards the chief conservationist of NRCS. So I think it really depends on what the it is and where we're going to put those resources.
Do others have thoughts on that topic in particular? Yeah, Brant.
Sarah, can I just follow up on that question?
Sure.
We've been talking a lot about public engagement, and I guess I'm wondering if there are opportunities to generate and implement educational curriculum about the loss of birds and the importance of birds in ecosystems. And is there any way for us to leverage STEM requirements in schools to try to get that information out there at scale? And I wonder if, Miyoko can address that, or any of the other panelists might be able to address that.
Yeah, I could mention that at the Lab of Ornithology, we have a K-12 program that does work with teachers and with curricula, developing curricula. So I think it would be interesting to bring this idea back to them and let them know what's developing on Road to Recovery so that they can think about that and how to reach classrooms. But there's definitely potential there.
I would also urge people to become, I know, like being a social media influencer, is that something that the kids talk about these days? I don't know anymore, but I would really encourage people to like be an influencer where you are. Like I'm at a state agency, so I've talked to our education people about trying to integrate bird topics and migration and ecology into we have a Discover Nature Schools curriculum. If you're in grad school or at a university, talk to your education department. I mean, just try and spread the word. I know it's scary and weird to reach out to people about these messages, but a lot of Audubon chapters ask grad students to talk at their chapter meetings about topics. Always at every opportunity when you get to talk to the public or colleagues, tell them. I talk to so many members of the public. We're talking about whether we should bring the public on board and have them come with us. They don't know. They don't know this stuff. They don't know that birds have been declining over this whole time, whereas we know that. They just don't know. And I feel that most of them are open-minded and saddened by that. They don't want to see our natural world go away like that. And birds are one of the easiest ways to connect with people about the outdoors. And so I feel strong that we really need to bring the public along in some way, at least present the information and they can take it or leave it. But there are a lot of people who care and everybody can do something at some level. We all know that from the 7 simple actions, or if you're a researcher in these larger scale questions. So there's always something that anyone can do. So I would really encourage all of you to take action as soon as possible and just tell people what's going on, because I think a lot of people do want to help.
I would totally agree with that, Sarah. And I would also say that like the way that I get a lot of my information and a lot of my friends do is through podcasts. And like I've had a lot of grad student friends who have just like talked a little bit about their work on podcasts. And I think that that's a really awesome way to get your ideas out there to a broader audience.
Absolutely. I feel that one of the ways that I'm most impactful as a state person, as a statewide person, is to break down the science into digestible bits of, you know, clearly we're scientists and we're sometimes not the best communicators, but trying to digest that for the audience and translate that into like layperson speak is sometimes some of the most effective ways we can do that. Anna, what other questions do we have in the Q&A to try and address some of those?
So many. And I just want to point out that there are a lot of comments in the Q&A as well. So I'm going to prioritize questions first, but people should look at those. A lot of them are at the top and there's some good ones. Another interesting question is one type of action that we haven't heard anything about is the development of networks of protected habitats and sites. I'm thinking of efforts like the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network for shorebirds, or in Europe, Natura 2000. The Convention on Migratory Species seems to be pretty invested in these network approaches to conservation. So what are everyone's thoughts on that?
All in. I mean, that was a success of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. I mean, that original plan was not very long, but it provided that framework that translated, we have population objectives we need to turn into habitat objectives, and with an implementation arm of the JVs who was absolutely mapping out what habitat we need, what network of habitat we need for migratory birds. And that the 3 billion birds report pointed out that waterfowl are doing pretty good because that we launched it that way. We seem to repeat that success with all the other bird groups, and we'll be all set.
That's all.
Easy task.
Easy. Does anyone else have comments on that one?
I guess this is where having all of the partners on the same page of what that network looks like was really important. Because then we're targeting those resources from so many different sectors and entities towards a singular goal. That I believe was one of the original visions for the state wildlife action plans, is through bottom up, state by state, can we map that conservation network for all species? And those maps of the state wildlife action plans are getting really good. But we also have tons of conservation network designs are out there. I'd like to see fewer new ones, and how do we use all the information we have to come up with an agreed upon blueprint for conservation. And I think we're probably really close to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with the particularly in the grasslands, with that 200 million acre goal, and as we're understanding integrated population models and the limiting stages in the life cycle, then where do those 200 million acres need to go? And as we look at a network, just being more flexible in a working landscape network of what that looks like, that's going to be a combination of public lands, that's going to be a combination of lands under easements, short and long term, that's going to be a combination of conservation reserve program lands, as well as just working private lands. And how do we better use some of those different landscapes and environment in a way to build up to the 200 million acres and have more collaborative conservation? When we have easements, have grass banks and have those impacts spread beyond the borders of those easements? Just thinking outside the box and more creative.
Yeah, can I just add? Tammy, you were freezing. I don't know if you're done.
She muted, I think he is, yeah.
Just want to add to that question, and part of Tammy's answer did that. It feeds back to the biology portions of this workshop, because it really depends a lot on the different kinds of species. And one of the reasons the WISRN network, Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, is, works as a network is because the information was saying that the shorebirds were highly concentrated in a small number of places along the hemisphere. And so it was the biological data that led to that reserve system. And now we're at the point, where these species that are so widespread and common across habitats and across landscapes, it does make it a lot harder to know where those reserves should be. So exactly as Tammy was saying, for the grassland birds, and it might not be a fixed location, because they might be in certain areas in wet years, certain areas in dry years. And as we're learning more and more about other parts of the life cycle, like migration stopover sites, if half of the world's population of a bunch of South American birds are funneling through the Sierra de Santa Marta in northern Colombia, I mean, that becomes a critical area, but a lot of birds don't really, might not concentrate like that. And so we really, that just feeds back to those basic questions of understanding where and when limitation is happening and what are the linked populations, because that's the key to being efficient with these, any network of reserves that we might want to put on the ground.
I'm looking at the Q&A, and so a number of questions and comments are revolving around the theme of working internationally. And so, kind of summarizing a group of those questions and trying to move away from just say, well, we have these instruments currently, we have Southern Wings, we have the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, all of which are really quite minimal. And, how do we up the game for those of us in North America working across international boundaries to really be working in the non-breeding season at the same time as we remain responsible and sensitive to the fact that folks working in Latin America don't want us telling them what to do. So what are the key ways of moving forward with non-breeding season conservation for birds that can navigate that tension between being sensitive and on the other hand being deliberate and providing the necessary funds?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that. I think part of it is what we've already talked about, is being more coordinated and strategic of the assets we already have. So, the Fish and Wildlife Service has the Neotrop grant program. It's a whopping $3.9 million over the entire Western Hemisphere. I'm still always amazed at the amount of conservation we get on the ground with that. And if you look at the project descriptions, they're amazing. But what if we were more coordinated and leveraged that with other Fish and Wildlife Service international grants in South America, with USAID funding, and with, if multiple entities were targeting a smaller subset of conservation needs, we could have a real impact. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity for work like that.
Noah, how do we make a neotropical migrant stamp?
Talk to Congress.
I just want to highlight one of the comments/questions in the Q&A that relates to this, because I think, so this comment is saying that like the NMBCA match requirement is like a really big issue for organizations in Central and South America trying to do this work. And so the idea in this comment is not sure how much awareness there is of the building of bird conservation investment strategies, but the R2R science being discussed here should underpin them. One part of these internationally co-created strategies is to leverage resources effectively, and that should include helping to fund these questions we want answered. This is a selling point because investors want to know where to effectively invest, and the NMBCA is encouraging proposals, but I suspect match is a limiting factor, so couldn't CISs pair the match for the research we need?
So as part of this, let me just add to that. So as part of this R2R effort, one of the things we're doing, a small group of us, but it's National Audubon, it's me, it's a bunch of other people, we're trying to actually gather the data to make the case to appropriators that we need to reduce that 3-to-1 match. And that's another way that we can, I totally agree with that comment, that we can actually have an impact on the conservation work that's done internationally. So that is, there's lots of ways, there's lots of levers that we have to think about and be creative about. One question I have for Noah is as important as the MBTA is, it is a relationship between the US, Canada, and Mexico, and Japan and Russia. There's a lot of other countries in the Western Hemisphere that are not a part of the MBTA. So what about reactivating things like the Western Hemisphere Convention and creating another conference of the parties, and have an annual conference of the parties, just like we do with the CBD and other groups, to start to activate countries throughout the Western Hemisphere about bird conservation?
I think it's an excellent idea. I think the incoming administration is going to want to be all out on reestablishing relationships with other countries. And I think doing that on the grounds of conservation would probably have a receptive audience to that. I know the Fish and Wildlife Service has played a pretty heavy role in the Western Convention many years ago, and it's kind of atrophied over time. But I think that's a tremendous opportunity. It's a cool convention we signed in 1940 that no one's ever heard of, and I think there's a lot of opportunities to leverage that.
That's exciting.
All right, I want to thank all our panelists. We're going to move to the larger Q&A now. I really appreciate all of your input and different perspectives. This has been a really, really great discussion, and feel free to ask questions of others and keep the great questions coming. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pete Mara. He's the director of the Georgetown Environment Initiative and the Laudato Si Professor of Biology and Environment at Georgetown University. He also served as a senior scientist at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center for 20 years. So I'll hand it over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for doing such a great job. Before we turn it over to a broad discussion, a virtual discussion with a couple hundred people, and get to a lot of those questions, great questions you have, I do want to make a few remarks about where this whole R2R effort has been and where we see this going broadly, because I think this is something that lots of people have an interest in. But even before I do that, I do want to put out a really big thank you to all the speakers, the moderators, the panelists, and all the folks participating these past few days. They've been, as Anna did such an expert job summarizing, the science has just been incredible. The interaction has just been wonderful, from the connectivity to the IPMs to the new and latest things we're thinking about. We saw this morning to this afternoon's panel about implementation and doing the broad things to scale up. This has been an exciting meeting. And I also want to say that, doing a virtual meeting, even though it seems like it doesn't take a lot of work, it takes a lot of friggin' work. It really does. And I want to just also acknowledge Anna Lalo-Smith, who's been incredible at this and helping us, and Amy Scarpignato has also been wonderful. Brent Ryder has been fantastic. And of course, my two long-term friends and buddies, Tom Will and Ken Rosenberg. Without these folks, it would have been impossible. So I just want to thank everybody and make sure everyone recognizes these wonderful people, and also the Knobloch Family Foundation for supporting these efforts and bringing science to conservation. They truly get it. So I do want to make a few other remarks just to sort of move us forward. So as we keep saying, you just can't publish a paper like this and go back to your day job. You just can't. We've got a crisis on our hands, folks, an extinction crisis. And we are all witness to this problem. As abstract as that sound, it's happening over such a long time frame. But when you take a quick sample of it, we're actually seeing it in real life. And to not do something about it would make us all basically complicit to this problem. So we have to act. And the first step to acting is really bringing people together, creating a campaign, activating people, trying to create change in a grassroots way, and getting people excited about doing the conservation science. So what we're really trying to do with these workshops is to create a movement, a conservation movement. And that's sort of where we're going with many of these workshops. But again, as one of the things that was also pointed out by lots, including Todd today, one of the big takeaways from this paper, the biggest takeaway for me, is that what we're doing in conservation, for whatever reason, is not working. And we have to reevaluate it from soup to nuts, from top to bottom. We have to reimagine in avian conservation programs, the instruments. You've heard people talk about this afternoon, the education, from the science to the policy, the whole thing. So that was our answer. Ken and I started talking about it, scratching our heads, and we came up with this sort of road to recovery idea. It probably went through 3 or 4 different names, but we landed on this road to recovery, which is a full-on reevaluation or reimagination of bird conservation efforts. So think about it as a road with many exits, right? And that first exit is really one that we've identified as identifying the priority species, the species that are just sort of on the brink, that are really close to sort of slipping into endangered species status. And that That, folks, is the last thing we want to happen. Once they become threatened and endangered, then they become political. Then it becomes a real challenge. Then it costs taxpayers enormous amounts of money. So we want to stop it from happening. We want to deal with those really important birds that are just teetering on the edge there. And so we've identified them. But as we've said over these last few days, we don't know why they're declining. So what can we do to bring them back? This is actually something that Fish and Wildlife Service did years ago, and they were called candidate species. We're calling it species on the brink now. Some might argue that you can't do species or science by species, but I totally disagree with that. And I think that one of the main messages, as Anna pointed out this morning, is that all these species differ in how they're limited in space and time, even within species. It doesn't mean the implementation has to be species by species, but understanding where we put our effort to get the biggest bang for our buck. So we can be more strategic, so we can be more careful with our conservation dollars. That's what we have to do. It's essential. But as I mentioned, that is only the first stage. It is not the only stage. It's the first exit, but not the only exit. We have to also think about how we're going to deal with these declining common species. It's on the road. I see it ahead. We've got to think about it. It's already come up in multiple conversations. And then there's the policy considerations that folks have talked about today as well. As Noah and I just went back and forth on this, MBTA as one of our primary instruments. Do we need to think about the CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species? Or perhaps we really think carefully about the Western Hemisphere Convention and ways that we can create a conference of the parties to bring people together, not in a virtual world, but maybe we start there, but in a real world. And so I'm really excited about that too. So there's also broad scale conservation efforts, but I feel like that's where we've been working, and it hasn't necessarily been enough because it hasn't been pinpointed. It hasn't been as strategic as we need it to be. And should we be hopeful? Yeah, we should be hopeful because there's several examples of success already. We've saved bald eagles, we've saved peregrine falcons, we've saved brown pelicans, we've saved Kirtland's warblers. We can manage ducks. We can do this as long as we organize and motivate. We have nothing but reasons to be optimistic and hopeful about this. So what's next for the Road for Recovery? Well, I think there's several things. One of the things that's burning away at me that Ken keeps on pounding away at me is, where's that paper? Where's that paper? Stop shaking your head, Ken. We're working on a paper to describe this Road to Recovery effort. And it's one of the things we really want to do is to get this in print. So we're working on not one, but actually two papers. One that describes the prioritization process and another that describes this larger Road to Recovery process. So we really feel strongly in the whole peer-reviewed process here. And we want to get this in writing as we think about this. And many of you will be involved with those processes. We also want to continue the workshops because we are overwhelmed by the amount of interest in these workshops and how it's bringing people together as partners and being interested in this. And we're envisioning multiple workshops in the future, one of which is going to be about implementation. I think one needs to be a full hemisphere workshop involving multiple groups. And I envision doing that with groups like BirdLife International to really bring people from Latin America and the Caribbean on board with this as well. We're open to as many of these as we possibly can because they're just so important. But I think there's two other key things that we're hoping to build as part of the Road to Recovery effort. And the first is a Road to Recovery fund that's actually going to support the science and ultimately the conservation on these species on the brink. We've identified so many really cool novel methods, whether it's the migratory connectivity, or it's the integrated population models, or it's building these conservation business plans. We need to strategize around these species and create this fund. And so we need to actually do this, and we're hoping to have this in place in the spring so we can actually support the research on these species. And then the next thing we're hoping to do is to bring on a quarterback, somebody who will actually oversee this entire effort, from organizing the science to organizing the policy to organizing the broad scale efforts around the Road to Recovery. So folks, we are thinking about the future. We are thinking about how to move this forward, and we've got to be proactive. And again, I think there's lots of reasons to be hopeful, lots of new science, lots of really exciting things moving forward here with Road to Recovery. And we want more and more people to be involved with this. This is not at all an exclusive thing. We want to spread the word as much as possible. So I'm going to stop there, and let's open this up to a broader discussion as much as we possibly can with 200 virtual people in my living room, or all of our living rooms. Thanks a lot, everybody, for joining in these last few days. Who's leading this? Tom, you leading this?
Well, we're looking for questions in the Q&A, and there's just a ton of questions and comments that were based on the previous panel. So I'm waiting for a few questions and comments. I assume, Pete, that you would like these comments to reflect mostly on the road to recovery and the future of the road to recovery and where people want to see it happen. I mean, I think the idea was to really ask folks, where do you want to see this go? Where do you folks who are listening to all this, where do you want to, what are your brainstorming ideas about next steps? What's the most important thing we want to do next?
I think we keep this broad. I mean, I thought the conversation was going so well with the implementation group. I felt bad jumping in there. So whatever comes up.
I'm seeing a lot of comments in the Q&A about the America's Flyways framework. So I don't know if people want to talk about that. I can read the initial comment about it, but yeah, there are a lot of people sort of jumping off of that. So flyway conservation uniquely needs both a local to global and global to local direction, I guess. Use of every tool in the conservation kit, from research to diagnose causes of declines and to define interventions that work. Could something like the America's Flyways framework help ensure coordination of concerted and cooperative action to achieve this, including presenting migratory bird conservation as nature-based solutions and a contribution to the green recovery? And then there's another comment kind of following up on that. The America's Flyways framework also links to bird conservation investment strategies, which was brought up before, as one method to organize action. There's some hope that CMS could be a forum to advance conservation investment strategies through improved engagement of foreign governments. There is at least that opportunity. And someone says that that should be a key topic of the next workshop. So.
Can people chime in verbally or?
Yeah. I mean, these are questions, and the expectation is that one of you or one of us will answer the question. I mean, are you saying can attendees chime in? I mean,
yeah, I was just wondering whether this was going to be a real.
I'm not quite sure how to manage 200 raised hands, but
a lot of people are responding to each other, and that's great. And they're probably, I'm sure there are people, in the participant audience who know a lot more about some of these particular topics than we do. I think in that case, the flyways, we probably don't have the expertise to answer the question from the panel, but we're very interested in, people who do. There seems to be a lot of comments about the international piece. And
that's one other piece of trying to influence where you are. And so again, I think that there's a lot of things we can do where each of us are, whether we're with an NGO or at the state level. We have been trying, we have put full annual life cycle conservation into our state wildlife action plan. I would encourage a lot of the other states to do that. I'm trying to start conversations to get this message about 3 billion birds, and potentially you all talking to the AFWA directors, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, because I think that whether or not it's us or one of the committees therein, I feel like states, kind of like some states and like some of the public, they just don't know that this is happening in this massive urgency, this major campaign we're talking about with the Road to Recovery amongst all of these professionals, and that it's this major urgent need. And I just don't know that that's being conveyed to, at least at the state level. So just trying to influence that where you are. I'm certainly trying to get out in front of more people at the state level. And you guys have really helped that with conversations like this. And I think that that's great. Yeah.
So I see one theme in the one theme that's cropped up in the Q&A and a few other comments, and I'm extrapolating a little bit. Personal observation or opinion suggests that 30 to of the R2R speakers will retire. How'd you know? Will retire in the next couple of years. So how do we, and I'm combining that statement or question, how do we sort of up the participation within the ornithological community, and particularly in academia, for people who are engaged not just in science, but also with public interface? And even incorporating another question, what is the strategy for changing the constituency of the leadership of R2R from being mostly mostly white guys like me to a much more inclusive group that includes more diversity?
Yeah,
Can I just,
first?
oh, okay, go ahead, Pete.
So the first thing I want to say is, Andrea, please don't be pessimistic just yet about the job market. I have several students and postdocs that are feeling the same way. And what I would say is that, in the pandemic, it has had a disproportionate hit on academic institutions because many of them cannot bring students on. They have not been able to generate the money that they want to generate. They're dipping into their endowments. They're not hiring. And so that's going to change. I really feel that that's going to change. So try not to be too pessimistic about that. But your point is a really good one, and it's a really important one. And we do need to change the face of this bird conservation community. This my top row, Ken, me, and Tom, white males. I 100% agree with you. We are doing a horrible job of including broader audiences into this conversation. And we need to figure out ways to diversify, be more equitable, and be more inclusive. And we're trying to do that in this effort, but we're not doing a good enough job. But we're working as hard as we can. We had a lot of women involved in these talks over the last few days, and we need to keep pushing on that. But it's pretty much all white, and so we need to change the face of the bird conservation movement as much as we need to make sure there are jobs for those new faces. So sorry, Brian, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm just going to cannibalize some of the comments that I was going to make in the wrap up here. Tom challenged us to come up with a message of hope. And for me, one of the things that was so hopeful was that we saw all this excellent conservation science from all of these young, extremely talented female scientists. And I think, as you just said, Pete, this represents the diversification of the conservation coalition. And I think it underscores the importance of having that diverse perspective in order to solve the complex conservation challenge. And while we may not be there yet, I think we are making steps towards that. And I do think that the participation that we tried to have, I'd like to view the glass as half full, is that we are trying to diversify that coalition. And while we may not be perfect, we're making steps in that direction.
Yeah, I'll just also, point out, if you look across the last 3 days, and we did make a conscious effort to do this, there were a lot of younger researchers, early career researchers presenting their studies and their new insights and new techniques, and of course Anna, being one of the faces of our team, is representing that. So we could always do better, but we're very conscious of that, and we're certainly making an effort. And I think, as Pete said, we're still very white, and we're still very US focused, and we're very aware of that. And so that's an area, even with our great friends in Canada, where we're not doing a good enough job working together and collaborating, and probably even in some of our topics in our language ends up being US centric, because that's the world that a lot of us are working and living in states and in US federal government. So we're very, very open to other suggestions and other people who want to help lead this effort. So yeah.
Yeah, I just can I just say something going off of that? I think that it's pretty clear that even though we do have some gender diversity here, it is still super white. And I think in terms of notes of hope, I think it's been really awesome and inspiring just after the events of this summer, after the protests really kind of woke a lot of people up, just how widespread the focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice has become across a ton of different institutions, a lot of different ornithological organizations. The Lab of Ornithology is working on this, AOS, and in the corporate world too. And hopefully it will be sustained and not just talk, but it really feels like there's been a shift. And I think a lot more people and a lot more organizations are really starting to try to figure out concretely how we can make spaces more inclusive and more equitable, and sort of bring more diverse voices into this, and also really just connect with more diverse voices that already exist and are already doing this research. I mean, yeah, people have been talking a lot about Latin America, and there's so much amazing work from researchers on the ground there that's already going on. And I think it's really just about connecting with those voices and those people and those organizations, and figuring out how to sort of bring them into leadership roles, and provide opportunities and funding, and just collaborate more. So yeah, I agree that there's a lot more work to do, but I think people are starting to work on it.
And I'd like to call attention to Jamie Stevens' comments in the Q&A, and folks can follow that link. And hats off to both the Eastern Partners in Flight Eastern Working Group and Partners in Flight Western Working Group, who in their recent conferences, virtual conferences, did a great job in including folks from Latin America and provided translation services for both of those workshops. So, that was really a great step forward, and both of those groups deserve a lot of thanks for doing that. And I watched some of those presentations, and I was amazed at as Anna said, the incredible wealth of knowledge and experience and expertise and just passion and energy present in our Latin American partners, and the work that they're doing is just phenomenal. So efforts like that, I think, are really stand out as being examples of how we can go.
Is that a focus of one of the future workshops that you all are thinking about, is having Latin American focus and having researchers and speakers from all these countries, like even talking to, George and Lily in Nicaragua, like leaders in these countries that are leading this bird conservation movement, whether or not they're reporting on a specific scientific research project, talking about how they mobilize people, what their greatest needs are, where the bottlenecks are for them getting work done, and how we up here can help without seeming colonialist about it and trying to tell folks what to do to fix things, but asking how we can help, but giving them the stage, to have them lead us.
Yeah, it has to be. And I've talked to Ian Davidson at BirdLife briefly about this, and we need to sort of really figure out ways to do this. Problem is these things take so much time, and we're limited by that. But as we build resources for this effort, I think we can do that. And I'd also like to touch upon, a few people have commented, I think CJ and a few others, how does this effort sort of bridge the gap with Partners in Flight, with NABC? Let's not recreate the wheel here, and I completely agree. And we are trying to figure out ways to, how do we, because we're not trying to create something new, we're just trying to come up with a response to this paper. But how do we activate or change a little bit the conservation efforts that are out there? So, we're trying to figure out how we sort of balance with these other existing efforts that are out there. So I also saw a few comments about people saying, enough with the rhetoric on the conservation is not working. I hear you. We can think of new ways to think about and talk about it in positive ways. I totally appreciate that comment. Thanks, folks.
Pete, how do you see the fund working? How do you see the Road to Recovery Fund working, and who would disseminate that, and what? Yeah, you said for science, then conservation, but how do you envision that working?
So we don't have a specific plan on this. We have actually, it might be more specific than you think, but it's a really good question. We've actually, in this pyramid, we've calculated for these I think roughly 45 species, not the total 70, what it would cost to move these species up the pyramid. And so without going into too many of the details, to move these 45 species up to this implementation stage where we're ready to do conservation on the ground, it's going to cost about $45 million, we estimate. And that's not chump change, but as Martin said so well on that first day, we need to up how we think about what it costs to do research and conservation on birds, or in his terms, look at all these telescopes and all of these various really fancy things that are out there that people use for science. We should have the same things in the bird conservation world. It may be that we need more money. We just need to figure out more creative ways to get that money. So I'm envisioning a avian philanthropy roundtable that brings together a variety of foundations, individuals, industry, as well as perhaps the feds that are putting money into this fund. I'm hoping it's somewhere between $1 and $5 million a year that's actually dedicated to the research to do this work. There are already many groups, recovery groups, that are in place for certain species that need the funding to do the connectivity work or need the funding to bring a postdoc on, to do the IPMs. We want to facilitate that happening as fast as we possibly can, so we can actually get to the stage that really matters, that conservation on the ground, the implementation stage. But it's not going to happen unless we create the funding and make it available for all these different people to do this work. It's one of the reasons we're trying to get this information out there so people understand the importance of connectivity, so people understand why these vital rates are really critical. So that's some of our ideas. We're hoping that the funds are going to support younger investigators, that they're going to, people are going to, in their proposals, will have a vision for how their species will move up that pyramid once they get funding for 1 or 2 or 3 years. So that's where it's at now. We're envisioning creating a steering committee of people that would be evaluating this. That might be the place for Partners in Flight, might be the spot for NAPSI. But that's sort of the idea is where it is right now.
Great.
Are you looking through questions or comments?
Well, there's so many great comments in the Q&A, and they are comments, and I'm trying to figure out. I mean, there was a comment earlier on that talked a little bit relevant to what you were, and I can't find it, but thinking about not just thinking about other ways to engage funding, and talking about corporate funding and other ways in which to think about institution like banks and like the World Bank, and how do we sort of mesh with those kinds of really big money to move bird conservation forward. And some of those funds are already being directed to conservation initiatives that may not explicitly involve birds, but nonetheless are so large in scale and scope that the intersection that we could make with those funds could really be a substantial way to move bird conservation forward. And thinking of some of the reforestation initiatives like 20 by 20 and things like that, even the global ones, and where birds aren't necessarily a feature in those initiatives, but where those initiatives could be sort of shaped in a certain way to be benefits for both birds and landscapes as a whole. So how do we go about that, and how do we incorporate that in our thinking about changing the way in which we fund bird conservation?
I couldn't agree with that more, Tom. I think we have to be as creative as we possibly can with figuring out ways to get money, whether it's addressing the 3-to-1 match for the NMBCA that Guy oversees, or it's going to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and trying to get our priorities worked into their initiatives. There are a lot of different ways to sort of to skin this cat. Sorry, got to say that. Guy asked about the importance of that non-federal match to supporting NMBCA grants. That's true, and he also asked about NSF opportunities, which is the traditional place where academics go. But NSF doesn't fund conservation like this. They might, if it's a really interesting, novel, quantitative approach, they might fund that. But there aren't really many funding mechanisms for what we're talking about. We're really, really talking about something unique and a really important need that we're trying to fill. And I think we can get people excited about this.
Yeah, I want to just elevate one of the comments I saw earlier. I think it was from Andrew Rothman. Just this idea of expanding the concept of joint ventures, which work so well in many of our regions in the U.S. Because they're not really as top down as many of our other efforts, and it really is a model for engaging the partners and the private landowners and whatever the stakeholder and constituency groups really are in those regions, as Todd was describing. But this idea is to expand the joint venture concept south of the border, and that if we really want to engage more with and help and work with Latin American partners, it should be more of a joint venture type model, because really almost anything, just look at our rectangles here, anything we come up with as ideas for working with Latin Americans is almost, not that it would be a non-starter, but it's really not the way to do it. And we need to be engaging people as partners and finding out what the needs are in those regions, and then how birds could potentially layer onto those in the same way that, for example, when Todd was talking about the water issues and the aquifer issues in the Playa Lakes, that was the key to engaging people in bird conservation, even if they didn't care much about birds. So finding those connections and doing it in a really true partnership model like a joint venture is something we should be thinking more about in other arenas also, I think.
You know, I really respect the work that Miyoko and that team did in terms of the kinds of outreach materials that they produced, and Sarah, you were very articulate in how useful they were to you as a state ornithologist. But it strikes me that simply really empowering that work, that team, and expanding that team has great potential. I think every day about how the events of 2020, early 2020 with George Floyd, et cetera, has really changed. If you pay attention to the ads on TV, has really changed the face of many television ads, that you now see many more people of color on TV ads. Well, the marketers of products, they get it. This is the changing demography of the United States. We need to address the people who are going to buy our products, and they are people of color, and they are more and more people of color. And then every time I see a car ad, I say, oh my God, why does General Motors have to show this picture of a vehicle skidding across the landscape, turning on its brakes, and making even deeper grooves into what would otherwise be a pristine, beautiful scene? How about the idea of having General Motors produce just one ad where people drive calmly up to the edge of a lake, jump out of the car, and get really excited about looking through their binoculars at a bird spectacle? The power of something like that, I think, can be just enormous in building ground constituency and getting people. I really do believe that there are tripping points in society, and all you have to do is kind of get over the edge of those points, and pretty soon people will be talking in a different way about the environment. So I think there's so much more we can do in the way in which we communicate to the rest of the world what conservation stewardship really can mean, and do it through what might seem like a pretty harmless change in the way in which our consumer advertising works. So I'm not in that world. It sounds like a simple idea, but I'm sure it's really complicated to do that. But all you need is one ear in General Motors or one ear in Ford to whisper into to make those changes. And so we need to find those avenues. It gets to Paul's question about how do we target our conservation strategies? We need to find influencers.
So Tom, Sarah Sargent points out that you should buy a Subaru because they do have ads like that already.
All right, I'm there. Be nice if it was a US produced vehicle though.
So building on that comment, Tom, and the conversation earlier about delivering science to on the ground managers, how do you, the panel here, see the Road to Recovery effort as a vehicle for delivering science to the general public and to on the ground managers? Like, what specific actions can you take or is in your plan to get that message out? Besides a nice commercial.
Yeah, I mean, we are hoping to continue to work. The team that Miyoko referred to still meets almost every Friday or bi-weekly, and Ken joins them. I join them as much as I possibly can. They are really excited to continue to drink the science Kool-Aid. As I love what Miyoko said about, throwing the pitch out so they can hit it. We'll hit them with as many balls as we can throw at them. It's so exciting to have a team that's so creative and so motivated like that, who can put this stuff out in such creative ways that broad audiences can digest them or hit the ball. So we really feel like that is in place like nothing else, that communications team to get out to broad audiences. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Ken.
Well, yeah, I think Miyoko did lay that out pretty nicely, and that group is expanding a little bit. So if there are people who would really like to be a part of that communication and outreach strategy group in particular, you can contact Miyoko or me, I guess. But I think as what Miyoko was really pointing out is it's now back in our court really to say, what is the next big piece of news or big result or big message? And, is there even something coming out of this workshop? I think back to Martin's one of the first talks on the first day. He showed that picture of the stork and how that one stork, reached more people than, the entire satellite network in a sense. And so, maybe we should all be thinking, as this workshop is coming to a close, all the participants and everything that we heard, what's an emergent news story that perhaps is even right in front of us now coming out of this workshop? I think we heard some incredible examples of the application of these new methodologies and techniques and to individual species, but then just the idea of those scientists coming together. So as Anna mentioned, all the people in the chat that said, yeah, I'll send my feathers to Kristen Ruick, just that synergy that's happening. I think it's up to us to find some of the real nuggets of that, of those results that are incremental. We can't wait, and it's not going to be a big headline, oh, we brought back the 3 billion birds. So we have to, I think, help craft what some of those incremental success stories are.
Amy, I would jump in and try to answer that question maybe from a slightly different perspective. And I think that one of the things we need to do as scientists is we need to engage diverse stakeholders early and often, and we need to engage them in the research process. And that involves doing things like designing studies that do effectiveness monitoring and understand the outcomes of management and conservation actions, knowing that those actions actually have population impacts. And then, as we've talked about internally on the R2R to kind of steering committee here, thinking about ensuring that when we don't meet conservation targets, that we have this adaptive feedback piece in all of our studies so that we can iteratively update management actions, so that it is this crosstalk between the science and the management. And that early on engagement, I think, ensures that.
I agree with that, Brant. And just to speak from a state perspective, when I presented at the NAOC as part of this webinar, which was amazing to have that opportunity and get in front of that many people about it, but asking, do you know the person who's in charge of in your land management agencies in your state or your region or near you? Have you talked with them about research? Normally they have a research group or branch that is doing research out there, and they have funding opportunities. And are you working with them? And I know it's just been like beat into me working for a state agency, but every single project I've ever put up, whether it's MODIS or continuing to inform full life cycle bird conservation, I know Missouri is very forward thinking in this with our department, but every single project is, how is this going to inform management? How is this going to inform management? You have to answer those questions before you even ask for $1. And so it's great that our department sees that in the long term, that return. But yeah, I would challenge a lot of the researchers out there, especially ones early in your careers or looking for jobs. State jobs are an option, and they're a good one, and you can inform things on the ground right there at the management scale. And really just keep that in the back of your mind as you move forward in your career of how is this going to impact work on the ground, and how can I tell people how it can impact work on the ground. So
So there's a comment from Lisa Sorensen, a good friend and executive director of the Birds Caribbean. And it's a tough question, but I'd like to read part of it and try to address it as much as I can, but I can't address it satisfactorily, unfortunately. But she says, in the Caribbean, mangroves, wetlands, wet and dry forests, seabird nesting keys, and shorebird coastal habitats are being destroyed on a regular basis. More research is not going to stop this. And she goes on. You can read the question itself in the Q&A. And Lisa, I completely agree. I spent my entire life working in the Caribbean and seeing this happen on a personal basis in multiple cases. And I think that I just want to emphasize that what we're proposing here for this first exit on the road to recovery is not the only exit on the road to recovery at all. It is just the first one to stop these species that are about to sort of, as I've said, drop into the T&E status. We can't let that happen. But it doesn't mean we can't at the same time work on these other big issues like that. And I completely support what you're doing and how we can help with that. I don't think we're going to be able to help much, but if we can do anything, that would be great. But these are bigger issues, and I have full support of those issues. But we do need to continue to do some research in some areas. There's just no question about it. We have to support science as well as the conservation.
This is unrelated to that comment, but I just wanted to point out, I think Tom was answering this, typing an answer in the Q&A, but in case people didn't see it, someone asked how they can find out about upcoming, like, new other R2R workshops that'll happen in the future. And we have the emails of everyone who registered and attended this workshop. And so when the new workshop is planned, we will be communicating with all of you, as well as many other listservs as possible. So yeah, you will be informed about upcoming workshops for sure.
And on a related note, once again, we, except for where I failed to start the recording on time, we have recordings of each session. Those are all already the day 1 and day 2 recordings have been posted on the Mara Lab website, and we'll post today's recordings there as well and eventually we'll have once we figure out how to format the chat and the Q&A, we'll have those files available as well. The recordings from the July Road to Recovery workshops will also be posted on that website, and we'll try to figure out a way to make that website be a central way to communicate future activities in the Road to Recovery as well. We'll work in conjunction with partners in the flight to broadcast whatever materials are produced. And so that would be a way to stay in touch also. Very good point. So we'll try to make the workshops, et cetera, as broadly available as possible, particularly in, while we have this remote way of doing things.
Well, should we wrap it up, guys? We'll.
Yeah. So today's Q&A is an amazing compendium of ideas. So it'll be really great when we get that into a format that makes sense. So we thank everybody for typing these great answers and comments and for participating. Any last words from Anna, Pete, Ken, Sarah, Brant?
I'm really looking forward to bird-friendly bourbon, I gotta say.
Yeah, that was Todd's idea, huh? Yeah, I'm looking forward. I'm hoping that, we'll continue to do this best we can in this kind of format, and we're very open to any suggestions from people and, if there are any better ways to engage groups, but we are hoping to eventually be able to do the kind of in-person conference that we had originally envisioned as well, and get everybody together, and maybe we all meet down at El Jaguar, Sarah.
Ooh, I like that idea.
People
I like that idea. Well, I just want to say something really briefly is that I'm really honored to be part of this group. I never really thought that I would be on a webinar with Pete Mara, Ken Rosenberg, and Tom Will, and all the big wigs of bird or like ornithological world, to be really honest, to say something really silly. But I keep waiting. After seeing these bird declines, it's just a really weighty issue. It weighs on me a lot. And, you know, all through this, I've been feeling like waiting for you guys and these older generations to tell us what to do next, you know? And I honestly don't think there's ever been a time that's more empowering for younger folks coming up as grad students and entering the professional world. Like, I know when I was in grad school, maybe I didn't know about this, but I don't think we had webinars where we were trying to empower grad students to take the lead and share their thoughts and ideas with the higher ups in this world. And I think that that's really great. I just think it's a time for all of us to think big and think outside the box, and we have to do it right now. So really try and influence where you are. If you can't move it up the chain, but just continue to work towards trying to talk to different people, put this out in front of different folks. And I just appreciate the opportunity, and really it's our time. We need to figure this out. And so I appreciate your all's leadership and the opportunity to speak on it or be part of it.
I think we give Sarah the last word.
Yeah, Sarah's last word.
So I have one last thing to say, and it's pretty simple. We think we're doing a great job saving birds, but think about this. It's really birds that are saving us.
Bye, everybody. Thanks. We'll be in touch.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right, thanks.
Tom,